Episode 1, The Bracelet.
When I was a kid, every World Cup meant spending time at my grandfather's house. We watched every match together. Years later, after he was gone, the habit stayed with me. I still watched every game I could. And a few weeks ago, one replay reminded me of my grandfather more than any match ever had. My name is Ethan. 3 weeks ago, a World Cup match completely changed the direction of my life. The strange part is that it didn't happen during the match itself. It happened afterward. A few friends had come over to watch one of the games. Nothing unusual. Pizza boxes on the table. Empty cans everywhere. The usual arguments about referees and missed chances. The match ended, but nobody left. Instead, we started doing what football fans always do after a game. We replayed everything. Goals. Missed opportunities. Questionable decisions. One of my friends was convinced a goal should have been disallowed. Another insisted the referee had gotten it right. For the next hour, we kept pausing, rewinding, and replaying the same moments. At one point the broadcast briefly cut to the crowd. A completely ordinary stadium shot. Supporters waving flags. People singing. People celebrating. Nobody in the room paid attention to it. Except me. Something caught my eye. Not immediately. Just for a split second. A bracelet. I didn't say anything. The image disappeared before I could even process what I'd seen. The discussion continued. My friends kept arguing. Someone rewound the goal again. Someone else complained about the commentary. But I wasn't really listening anymore. I was thinking about that bracelet. A few minutes later the same crowd shot appeared again during another replay. This time I looked more carefully. And my stomach tightened. Because I knew that bracelet. Or at least I thought I did. I stayed quiet. The last thing I wanted was to stop a room full of football fans and explain that I was interested in a piece of jewelry I'd seen for 2 seconds in a crowd. Even in my own head it sounded stupid. So I let it go. At least outwardly. Around midnight everybody went home. I cleaned up the apartment. Turned off the television. And tried not to think about it. That lasted maybe 10 minutes. Eventually I walked over to my desk. Opened a drawer. And took out a small wooden box. Inside was a bracelet that had belonged to my grandfather. Growing up, I'd seen it hundreds of times. It wasn't famous. It wasn't expensive. As far as anyone in my family knew, it was simply a rare piece of craftsmanship that my grandfather had bought decades earlier. He loved showing it to people. Whenever somebody complimented it, he'd always say the same thing. Best craftsmanship I've ever owned. Then he'd smile and put it back in its box. That was the entire story. At least, that's all I ever knew. I sat down at my desk and stared at the bracelet. Then I laughed. Because the idea was ridiculous. The bracelet I'd seen on television couldn't possibly be the same one. There were millions of people watching the World Cup. Tens of thousands inside the stadium. The odds were absurd. So I put the bracelet away and went to sleep. The next morning I woke up still thinking about it. That annoyed me. I had work to do. Things to focus on. Instead I found myself opening my laptop and loading the replay. I skipped through the match until I found the crowd shot. Then I paused it. Rewound. Paused again. This time I wasn't trying to identify the supporter. I was looking only at the bracelet. The image quality wasn't great. The shot lasted maybe 2 seconds. But the longer I stared at it, the less comfortable I became. The shape looked right. The clasp looked right. Even the proportions looked right. Not identical. Just close enough. I pulled my grandfather's bracelet out again and placed it beside the screen. Then I spent 10 minutes comparing the two. By the end, I still couldn't prove anything. But I couldn't dismiss it anymore either. That was the problem. If the bracelet on television had been completely different, I would have forgotten about it. If it had been obviously identical, I would have had an answer. Instead, I was stuck in the middle. Just enough similarity to bother me. Not enough to explain it. That afternoon I called my father. I asked him a question I had never asked before. How much do we actually know about Grandpa's bracelet? The answer turned out to be surprisingly little. Nobody knew who made it. Nobody knew how many had been produced. Nobody even knew exactly when my grandfather bought it. All we really knew was that he loved it. That was it. After the call ended, I spent the rest of the evening searching online. Collector forums. Auction archives. Old jewelry catalogs. Anything. I expected to find examples of similar bracelets everywhere. Instead, I found nothing. No matching design. No history. No maker. Nothing. Which somehow made the whole thing worse. Because now I had two possibilities. Either I was imagining a connection that didn't exist, or my grandfather's bracelet wasn't nearly as unique as we'd always believed. Late that night I watched the replay one last time. Then I made a decision. The next morning, I was going to find the supporter. Because I needed to answer one question. Was my grandfather's bracelet really rare? Or had my family been wrong all along?
Episode 2, The Supporter.
Finding the supporter turned out to be much easier than finding the bracelet. That surprised me. I honestly didn't expect to find anything. After all, I had almost nothing to work with. A blurry crowd shot. A World Cup match. And a bracelet that might not even be the same one. But football fans document everything. Photos. Videos. Posts. Comments. Within a few hours, I had found several photographs taken in the same section of the stadium. The supporter appeared in two of them. Not clearly, but clearly enough. One of the photos had been posted by a supporter group. People in the comments were tagging friends they recognized. After following a few profiles and a few conversations, I eventually found the person I was looking for. By the end of the day, I had a name. The problem was that I still didn't have an answer. For 2 days I debated whether I should contact them. The entire thing felt ridiculous. What was I supposed to say? Hello. I think you own my grandfather's bracelet. Eventually curiosity won. I sent a message. Short. Polite. And vague enough that I didn't sound completely insane. To my surprise, I received a reply the following morning. The supporter was friendly. Confused. But friendly. And after a few messages back and forth, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me since the match. Could I see the bracelet? A few hours later a photograph arrived. I opened it immediately. Then stared at it in silence. Because the bracelet wasn't similar. It wasn't inspired by the same design. It wasn't really close. It was the same bracelet. Or at least it looked like it. The same shape. The same metal. The same clasp. Even the same tiny engraved mark near the fastening. I placed my grandfather's bracelet on the desk beside my phone. Then I compared them for nearly half an hour. I wanted to find a difference. Any difference. Instead I found almost none. The only thing that stopped me from declaring them identical was common sense. Surely there had to be an explanation. There always was. I asked where the bracelet came from. The answer surprised me. The supporter didn't know. Not really. It had belonged to a grandparent. Then to a parent. Then eventually to them. That was all. No story. No craftsman. No explanation. Just an old family object that had always existed. For a moment I sat back in my chair and laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because suddenly I wasn't the only person with this problem. My family thought the bracelet was unique. Their family apparently thought exactly the same thing. That realization bothered me more than anything else. If my grandfather had been wrong, that was one thing. But now there were two families. Two histories. Two bracelets. And both believed they owned something special. Something rare. Something that didn't exist anywhere else. I asked one final question. Had they ever seen another one? The answer came back almost immediately. No. Neither had I. At least, not until the World Cup. That evening I placed both photographs side by side. My grandfather's bracelet. The supporter's bracelet. I stared at them for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then I noticed something strange. Not on the front. On the back. The photograph wasn't detailed enough to be certain. But one of the engraved lines appeared slightly different. Not damaged. Different. Intentional. I enlarged the image. Then enlarged it again. My heart started beating faster. Because for the first time since this whole thing began, a new possibility appeared. What if these bracelets weren't copies? What if they were parts of something? I spent most of the night trying to convince myself the idea was absurd. By morning I had failed. And later that afternoon, I found a photograph that made the situation even stranger. Because there wasn't just a second bracelet. There was a third.
Episode 3, The Third Bracelet.
I spent the next 2 days staring at photographs. That sounds ridiculous. It probably was. But every time I looked at the two bracelets, I noticed something new. Not similarities. Differences. At first that seemed unimportant. If two bracelets came from the same craftsman, small differences were normal. Handmade objects are never perfectly identical. In fact, that's usually what makes them valuable. But the differences I was seeing didn't feel random. That bothered me. I showed both photographs to a friend who worked with digital design. I didn't tell him the story. I didn't mention my grandfather. I simply asked what he thought. He stared at the images for a while. Then pointed at the back of one bracelet. That's strange. What is? The engraving. I leaned closer. What about it? He pointed to a curved line running across the back. Look at where it stops. I looked. Then at the other bracelet. The line stopped there too. Not in the same place. But abruptly. As if both designs continued somewhere else. For a moment neither of us said anything. Then he shrugged. Probably nothing. Maybe. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening I contacted the supporter again. This time I asked for more photographs. Front. Back. Close-ups. Anything. To my surprise, they were just as curious as I was. The pictures arrived an hour later. I spent the rest of the night comparing them to my grandfather's bracelet. By midnight I had become convinced of one thing. The engravings weren't random. I still didn't know what they meant. But they were intentional. The following morning I posted the photographs on a collector's forum. Not a popular one. A small community dedicated to handmade metalwork. I wasn't expecting much. Mostly I hoped somebody would recognize the craftsman. Instead, somebody recognized the bracelet. At least, part of it. The reply appeared less than 3 hours later. I read it twice before I believed it. The user claimed they had seen a bracelet with a nearly identical pattern years earlier. Not online. Not in a museum. In their own family. My heart immediately started racing. I sent a message. Then another. By the end of the day we were exchanging photographs. And that's when everything changed. The third bracelet wasn't identical either. It had the same proportions. The same clasp. The same style. But the engraving on the back was completely different. Different. Yet somehow connected. I opened all three images side by side. My grandfather's bracelet. The supporter's bracelet. The newly discovered one. For several minutes I just stared. Then I noticed something. A line from the first bracelet seemed to continue on the second. And another appeared to continue on the third. Not perfectly. Not obviously. But enough to make me sit upright. For the first time, a possibility entered my mind. What if I wasn't looking at three versions of the same bracelet? What if I was looking at three parts of something larger? I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I called the owner of the third bracelet. Our conversation lasted almost an hour. Most of it wasn't useful. The bracelet had belonged to his grandfather. Before that, nobody knew. The story sounded familiar. Almost identical to mine. A family heirloom. A forgotten craftsman. No records. No history. Just a bracelet. 3 families. 3 countries. 3 bracelets. And somehow the same mystery. Before hanging up, I asked one final question. Have you ever seen another one? There was a pause. Then he laughed. Funny you should ask. My stomach tightened. Why? Because a few years ago, somebody contacted my father asking exactly the same thing. I froze. What happened? I don't know. My father never followed up. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I asked the obvious question. Did that person mention how many bracelets existed? Another pause. Then. No. I thanked him and ended the call. But one thought stayed with me for the rest of the day. Someone had been asking these questions before I was. Someone had been looking for these bracelets. And for the first time since the World Cup match, I started wondering if I was actually following a trail. Or walking into one. At that point I knew 3 bracelets existed. What I didn't know was that the 4th one had been sitting in plain sight the entire time.
Episode 4, The Craftsman's Grandson.
Finding the 3rd bracelet changed the way I looked at the entire mystery. Until then, I had been asking the wrong question. I kept wondering how many bracelets existed. What I should have been asking was much simpler. Who made them? 3 families. 3 countries. 3 bracelets. And somehow nobody knew anything about the craftsman himself. That seemed impossible. Objects survive. Names survive. Stories survive. Yet the person who had made all 3 appeared to have vanished completely. For the next week, that became my focus. Not the bracelets. The craftsman. The breakthrough came from the owner of the 3rd bracelet. His family still had something mine didn't. A receipt. Not an original one. Just an old handwritten copy made decades earlier. Most of the ink had faded. The address was useless. The business no longer existed. But the craftsman's surname was still readable. For the first time, I had something real. A name. The search took less than a day. That was the strange part. For weeks I'd been chasing bracelets. Now I was chasing a person. And people are easier to find. By the following evening, I had found the craftsman's grandson. At first I wasn't sure I should contact him. The story sounded absurd even to me. 3 bracelets. 3 families. 1 forgotten craftsman. I wasn't sure how to explain any of it. Eventually I sent an email. Then I waited. The reply arrived the next morning. It was shorter than I expected. Just 1 sentence. How many have you found? I read it twice. Then a 3rd time. Not. What bracelets? Not. Who are you? Not. I think you've got the wrong person. How many have you found? For the first time since the World Cup match, I felt certain I wasn't the first person asking questions. We arranged a video call that same day. The grandson was older than I expected. calm, patient, and completely unsurprised by the entire situation. That bothered me immediately. I hesitated. Then I remembered something. There's something else. The old man looked at me. What is it? I told him about the conversation with the owner of the third bracelet. About the man who had contacted his father years earlier. The old man's expression changed immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. I wondered when that story would surface again. My pulse quickened. You know who it was? Not exactly. The answer disappointed me. But he continued. About 20 years ago, a historian contacted my family. A historian? The old man nodded. He wasn't looking for jewelry. He was researching forgotten craftsmen. What happened? He found 2 bracelets. I stared at him. Only 2? 2. He believed there were more, but he never managed to locate them. What was his name? The old man smiled sadly. I don't remember. My grandfather spoke with him only once. What happened to him? No idea. The answer felt frustratingly incomplete. But it also explained something. Someone had followed the same trail long before I did. The difference was that he had reached a dead end. We hadn't. I told him about my grandfather's bracelet. The supporter from the World Cup. The third bracelet. Everything. When I finished, he nodded. Then he asked. 3? 3. He smiled. Not because he was happy. More because he had expected that answer eventually. What does that mean? I asked. For a moment he looked away from the camera. Then he stood up. A few seconds later he returned carrying a small wooden box. My pulse immediately started racing. The box looked old. Much older than the bracelets. He placed it on the table but didn't open it. Instead he rested a hand on top of it. My grandfather told me something when I was a child, he said. I didn't interrupt. He said that one day somebody would come looking for these. I frowned. These? The old man nodded toward the box. But he also told me something else. What? He told me never to go looking for them myself. The answer made no sense. Why? The old man laughed softly. I asked the same question. And? He said that if he had done his job properly, they would eventually find their way back together. Before I could respond, the old man raised a hand. There is one thing I do know. I waited. My grandfather never intended to keep the 4 bracelets together. That surprised me. Why not? Because they were never made for a single owner. The old man leaned back in his chair. According to my father, each bracelet was given to someone he respected. Friends? Some. Clients. Apprentices. One was a gift of gratitude. I frowned. So he separated them on purpose? The old man nodded. He believed the design belonged to no single person. For a moment, I wasn't sure I understood. Then he smiled. My grandfather used to say that a masterpiece is safer in 4 stories than in 1 box. The idea stayed with me. The bracelets had never been lost. They had been distributed. Protected not by locks or vaults, but by families. I stared at him. That sounded less like an explanation and more like a riddle. The old man seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. He wasn't talking about magic, he said. He wasn't talking about fate. Then what was he talking about? This time the old man smiled. I've spent 40 years trying to figure that out. For several seconds neither of us spoke. And for the first time since this story began, I realized something. The craftsman had never expected one person to own all 4 bracelets. He had expected someone to eventually find the others. The old man finally opened the box. Inside was the fourth bracelet. At first, I thought he had brought the wrong one. The bracelet looked nothing like the other three. Different shape. Different engraving. Different proportions. For a few seconds I honestly believed we had made a mistake. Then the old man smiled. My grandfather always said this would happen. What would? The fourth one always confuses people. And for the first time in decades, all four had been found. Or at least that was what the old man believed. Because sitting in front of me was a bracelet that looked like it belonged to an entirely different collection.
Episode 5, The Design.
For almost a month, the mystery had been growing. First there was one bracelet. Then two. Then three. Now, for the first time in decades, all four had finally been found. The strange part was that nothing had actually changed. The bracelets were still sitting in 4 different places. Mine was on my desk. The second belonged to a supporter I'd never met in person. The third was in another country. The fourth remained with the craftsman's grandson. Nobody was willing to ship them anywhere. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. I wouldn't have sent mine either. So we did the next best thing. Photographs. Scans. Measurements. Every detail we could collect. For 3 days, we compared everything. The fronts. The sides. The clasps. The engravings. And slowly a pattern began to emerge. The bracelets weren't identical. That much was obvious. But they weren't independent designs either. The fourth bracelet complicated everything. The first 3 clearly belonged together. The fourth didn't. At least not at first glance. Its design seemed completely unrelated. Different enough that I briefly wondered whether the craftsman's grandson had been wrong all along. Every line seemed to stop where another bracelet began. Every curve looked unfinished. As if each bracelet contained only part of a larger drawing. By the 4th day, even the most skeptical among us had stopped arguing. The connection was real. The only question was what the connection meant. Late that night, the craftsman's grandson sent a message. Just 3 words. I think it works. Attached was an image. I opened it immediately. Then sat in silence. For several seconds, I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. The 4 bracelets had been digitally aligned. Rotated. Scaled. Positioned side by side. And for the first time, the engraving on the back made sense. Not completely. But enough. The scattered lines became continuous. The fragments became intentional. The breakthrough came from the 4th bracelet. Not the first 3. Once we rotated it 90 degrees, several disconnected lines suddenly joined together. The bracelet that appeared least important turned out to be the key piece. And at the center of the design was something none of us expected. A bracelet. Not one of ours. A different one. A design. A sketch. A blueprint. Whatever the craftsman had hidden across the 4 pieces, it wasn't a message. It was a creation. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I zoomed in. Then again. Every line looked deliberate. Every detail looked planned. This wasn't something somebody would accidentally split across 4 bracelets. It had been designed that way from the beginning. I called the craftsman's grandson immediately. He answered before the first ring finished. You saw it. Yeah. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I asked the obvious question. What are we looking at? The old man laughed softly. I've been wondering that for 40 years. I looked back at the image. The design was beautiful. Complicated. Unlike anything I'd seen before. And somehow that made the situation even stranger. Because if this was the craftsman's masterpiece, why hide it? Years earlier, I would have assumed the answer was money. Or secrecy. Or fear of theft. Now I wasn't so sure. The craftsman's grandson had shown us enough of the notebook to reveal a pattern. His grandfather never wrote about protecting the design from strangers. He wrote about protecting it from being finished too quickly. According to several notes, he believed the bracelet meant nothing unless someone understood how it came together. Anyone could inherit an object. Anyone could buy one. But rebuilding an idea required patience, trust, cooperation. For different owners. For different stories. The separation wasn't a security measure. It was part of the design. The craftsman hadn't hidden the masterpiece because he wanted nobody to find it. He had hidden it because he wanted the right people to earn it. Why scatter it across 4 separate bracelets? Why make it almost impossible to reconstruct? The old man seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. There's something else, he said. What? The old man hesitated. Then he leaned forward. My grandfather hid something. I frowned. What do you mean? He always talked about a box. A box. The old man nodded. He never kept it in the house. Never told anyone where it was. My pulse immediately jumped. What's inside? I don't know. That answer surprised me. You never found it? No. Why not? He smiled. Because he never wanted it found. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he pointed at the image on my screen. The 4 bracelets. The completed design. The hidden engraving. My grandfather always said the answer was with the bracelets. I looked back at the image. For the first time, I realized we had been looking at the wrong thing. The bracelets weren't the destination. They were directions. The old man stood up and disappeared from the camera for a few seconds. When he returned, he was holding a faded notebook. He opened it carefully. Most of the pages were filled with sketches and measurements. Then he stopped on a page near the back. There. I leaned closer. At the center of the page was a sentence written in the craftsman's handwriting. When the 4 become one, the path will reveal itself. My heart started racing. Path to what? The old man slowly closed the notebook. To the box. And for the first time since the World Cup match, I felt certain we were finally asking the right question. Not who made the bracelets. Not why they existed. But what had been important enough to hide. What I didn't know was that the answer had been waiting for decades.
Episode 6, The Masterpiece.
For almost a month, the mystery had been growing. First there was 1 bracelet. Then 2. Then 3. And finally 4. Now, for the first time in decades, all 4 designs sat side by side on our screens. The strange thing was that none of us cared much about the original bracelets anymore. Not really. The mystery had moved beyond them. The completed design filled my monitor. For several minutes, nobody on the call said a word. The supporter's bracelet. The 3rd bracelet. My grandfather's bracelet. And the one that had remained with the craftsman's family. Separately, they were interesting. Together, they were extraordinary. The first 3 pieces had connected almost exactly as we'd expected. The 4th had surprised all of us. Its design looked completely different on its own. But once rotated and aligned correctly, several unfinished lines suddenly connected. The bracelet that seemed least important turned out to be the final piece. The discovery solved another mystery we hadn't fully understood. For weeks, we had been wondering why the 4th bracelet looked so different from the others. The answer suddenly seemed obvious. It wasn't meant to look like the others. The first 3 bracelets had been designed to attract attention. They shared similar proportions, similar construction, and similar engraving styles. Anyone comparing them would immediately notice the connection. The 4th bracelet served a different purpose. It was the lock hidden among the keys. If all 4 bracelets had looked alike, someone might have assembled the design decades earlier. Instead, the craftsman had disguised the final piece as something unrelated. Only when the bracelet was rotated and aligned correctly did its true role become visible. The grandson nodded when we showed him the reconstruction. My grandfather used to say that the last piece should never reveal itself too quickly. For the first time, the fourth bracelet made perfect sense. It wasn't different because it didn't belong. It was different because it was the most important piece of all. For the next few days, we refined the image. Better scans. Better measurements. Better alignment. Every adjustment revealed something new. The more accurate the reconstruction became, the more obvious one thing seemed. This wasn't a puzzle. It wasn't a code. It wasn't a map. It was exactly what it appeared to be. A bracelet design. The final design. The one the craftsman had spent years protecting. The craftsman's grandson eventually broke the silence. I think this is it. Then he remembered something. The box. For a moment nobody spoke. I had almost forgotten about it. The hidden box. The one his grandfather had mentioned for decades. The answer came from the design itself. Not immediately. For 2 days, we kept studying the reconstructed image. At first, all we saw was the bracelet. Then the craftsman's grandson noticed something hidden along the outer edge. Several decorative lines matched markings in his grandfather's notebook. Measurements. Distances. Reference points. What looked like ornamentation was actually a set of instructions. Not a map. A guide. Using the measurements from the completed design and several sketches from the notebook, we finally identified the place his grandfather had been referring to. An old workshop property that had remained in the family for decades. The box had never been far away. It had been hidden inside a sealed compartment beneath a workbench that nobody had used in years. When the grandson opened it, the lock was rusted. The wood was cracked. But the box was still there. Waiting exactly where the craftsman had intended. The design, he said quietly. Maybe this is what it was for. A few minutes later he disappeared from the call. When he returned, he was carrying the faded notebook again. This time he opened it to the final page. There was no map. No address. No instructions. Only a single sentence. Build it first. Nobody disagreed. Because there was nothing left to solve. The design was complete. The mystery that had started in a World Cup crowd had finally led us here. Then the supporter asked the question all of us were thinking. So what happens now? For a moment nobody answered. Then I looked at the design again. For weeks we had been chasing the same thing. Not money. Not treasure. Not a secret. Just understanding. And now we had it. The craftsman's grandson smiled. My grandfather never made this bracelet. I looked up. You know that for sure? He nodded. I've spent years looking through everything he left behind. And I've never seen a photograph of a finished version. The room went quiet again. The design existed. The bracelet didn't. For the first time, the box made sense. Whatever waited inside wasn't meant to be found first. The bracelet was. At least, not yet. Then the owner of the third bracelet laughed. We've come this far. The supporter laughed too. I smiled. Because I already knew what he was going to say. We should make it. Nobody argued. For the first time since the World Cup match, everybody agreed on something. The biggest mystery was finally solved. But one important question still remained. We sent the completed design to a workshop recommended by the craftsman's grandson. And for the first time in decades, someone began creating the bracelet the craftsman himself never finished. Nobody argued. The following day, the grandson opened the box during a video call. After all those years, the contents turned out to be surprisingly simple. No treasure. No hidden fortune. No secret collection. Just a letter. The grandson unfolded the paper carefully and began to read. The letter was shorter than I expected. But far more personal. It explained something we had all been wondering. The craftsman had never completed the bracelet. Not because he lost interest. Not because he wanted to create a mystery. He simply ran out of time. In the final years of his life, his eyesight began to fail. The notebook contained dozens of revisions, measurements, and sketches, but no finished piece. According to the letter, he spent years trying to perfect the design. Each version revealed something he wanted to improve. Each improvement created another problem to solve. Eventually he realized he might never finish it himself. So he made a different decision. He divided the design into 4 bracelets and entrusted them to people he believed would preserve them. Not as owners. As caretakers. One paragraph in particular stayed with me. If the design is worthy, it will survive me. If it survives me, one day someone will finish it. For several seconds, nobody on the call spoke. The mystery suddenly felt much smaller. And much more human. A letter written by the craftsman. And after everything we'd been through, it felt strangely perfect. Not because it was expensive. Not because it was rare. Because it was complete. The craftsman's grandson was the first to speak. My grandfather would have loved this. According to the letter, that was all he had ever wanted. Not for the bracelets to stay together. Not for them to become valuable. Only for somebody, someday, to finish what he couldn't. For a while, none of us said anything. The mystery was finally complete. A few weeks later, the finished bracelet arrived from the workshop. And 3 months after that, we decided it was finally time to meet in person.
Episode 7, What the Craftsman Left Behind.
3 months later, we met in person. The mystery had already been solved. The letter had been read. The bracelet had been completed. Now, for the first time, all 4 original bracelets were in the same room. The supporter brought theirs. The third owner brought his. The craftsman's grandson brought the 4th. And I brought my grandfather's. Looking at them together felt strange. For weeks they had existed only as photographs on a screen. Now they were real. 4 different objects. 4 different histories. One design. The craftsman we had spent months researching never got to see the final bracelet. My grandfather never knew the truth. Sometimes I wish I could have shown him the finished bracelet. Not because of its value, but because of the story behind it. He spent years believing he owned something rare. In the end, he turned out to be part of something far rarer than he ever imagined. Neither did the families who owned the other pieces. Yet somehow all of them had helped bring it back together. The workshop finished the bracelet exactly as the design showed. For a long moment, nobody touched it. We simply looked. The bracelet was unlike any of the 4 originals. Familiar. Yet completely new. Elements from every bracelet were visible within it. The flowing lines from the first. The geometric details from the second. The curved engraving from the third. And the hidden structure that had been concealed inside the 4th. For the first time, the design existed as a complete object rather than a collection of fragments. The craftsman's grandson stared at the photographs for several seconds. Then he smiled. I think this is exactly how he imagined it. None of us could prove that. But looking at it, we all felt the same thing. Not because of anything new. That we had finally finished something old. I think he was right. A few days later, the 4 original bracelets were returned to their owners. And we all agreed that the completed bracelet should remain with the craftsman's grandson. After all, without his grandfather's vision, none of this would have happened. It felt right that the finished masterpiece stayed with his family. Exactly where they belong. Nothing was sold. Nothing was traded. Nothing changed. And yet everything felt different. The mystery that began during a World Cup replay was over. The supporter returned home. The third owner returned home. The craftsman's grandson returned home. And so did I. Sometimes people spend their lives searching for something valuable. Looking back, people often ask the same question. Was the World Cup a good guide for me? The honest answer is yes. If the camera had been pointed anywhere else, I would never have seen the bracelet. If that supporter had chosen a different seat, our paths would never have crossed. Nothing about that moment had been planned. At least not by us. But over time, I began to understand what the craftsman may have meant when he said the pieces would find their way back together. Enough years pass, enough people live their lives, and eventually forgotten stories collide. The World Cup guided me toward a mystery I never knew existed. What surprised me was discovering that value isn't always hidden inside an object. Sometimes it's hidden inside a story. For most of my life, I believed my grandfather owned a rare bracelet. In the end, I learned something much stranger. Sometimes an object isn't rare because it stands alone. Sometimes its rarity only becomes visible when all the missing pieces finally come together.